Hi, so our video is on muscle tissue healing. We're going to combine the first two questions because they kind of interconnect. So the first question is, how is muscle tissue damage similar or different from normal tissue healing? And the second question is, how does muscle tissue heal? What are myoblasts? And what time frame is expected for the healing process? So to start this off, we're going to explain the two different types of tissues we have in our body. They are hard tissue and soft tissue. An example of hard tissue is bones, so we're not going to talk about that. And an example of soft tissue are muscle tissue. There are three types of different muscle tissues. They are cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. For the purpose of this video, we're going to talk about skeletal muscle tissue because we are exercise science majors. So the main difference that we found out with the healing process with muscle tissue and normal tissue is that the healing process actually has 4 phases compared to the normal tissue that has 3. The 4 phases are bleeding phase, which is the main difference in the normal tissue healing process, inflammatory, fibroblastic, and remodeling. In the bleeding phase, this is where the muscles will bleed because they're a highly vascular organ. Second phase is the inflammatory phase or the destruction phase. And here we have macrophages, which help clean up the site of injury and take out all the stuff that we don't want in the injury site. And to think of this, you can think of Pac-Man trying to clear up the stage and eating all the pellets around to clear up the stage. Third phase is fibroblastic or the repair phase, and here we are introduced to myoblasts. Myoblasts are actually satellite cells around in the surrounding area that come together and become myoblasts. And in order to explain what myoblasts are, I'm going to break down the word. So myo means muscle, blast means buildup. So the purpose of myoblasts are to help build up the muscle. You can think of these as little Lego pieces that you put together to build a bigger design or model. Fourth phase that we have is the remodeling and maturation phase, and here is the rehab phase where you want to build up the site of injury or muscle back to where it was prior to the injury. So the healing times that we have for each phase are: the bleeding phase is from the injury to a few hours, inflammatory is from a few hours to 4 days, fibroblastic is from 4 days to 6 weeks, and remodeling is from 2 weeks onward. This depends on the location and severity of the injury and also if the patient is compliant to the treatment. So third question. Considerations for healing strategies, tensile force, and examples of muscle tissue injury. So considerations for healing strategies we have are rest, ice, compression, and elevate. The acronym for that is RICE to help you remember it. So rest, you just want to rest the muscle or the injury. Ice, you want to ice it preferably 10 to 15 minutes at a time because you do not want to intrude on the inflammatory response. Compression, which is massaging or wrapping it up in a band, and elevate is elevating above your heart to slow down blood flow. We also included rehabilitation into the healing strategy. Tensile forces we have are gravitational, tension, and rotational. Gravitational is just that the gravity pulling on your body, so it affects every single muscle and you can't control it. Tension is where you have stretch or contraction. An example of this would be propulsion when you run, which will affect your soleus and your calf muscle. Rotational is a situational one where we thought of the example was throwing a football or a ball. That would affect your rotator cuffs. The rotator cuffs muscles are sits. This is a good way to remember it, which are the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. The examples of muscle injury that we found were muscle strain, which is you can get from curling, bicep curling too much weight, which will cause a tear in your muscle. and contusion, which is bruising from an impact anywhere on the muscle. And that is all for this video.